Beware, beware, for where she goes, death and destruction are sure to follow. If you see her come to your country, run for the hills. Beware, she is the White Death, the Yellow Plague. She is a Karen.
70 dead and counting.
So we have to maintain UN principles of international law and, fuck the EU, that protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every single country, notably including Ukraine. And U.S. advisors serve in almost a dozen Ukrainian ministries and localities.
How does Jabba the Hutt over here get to decide what happens in Ukraine? Who exactly is this person? In this first video of many, we begin a series called Unmasking the Deep State, starting with our favorite Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. You can find sections of the video highlighted for you at the bottom should you like to skip to certain parts. But for now, let's begin from the beginning, her childhood. Chapter 1. Young Victoria Nuland. Victoria was born on July 1st, 1961 in New York City. Her mother, a gifted pianist. Her father, Sherwin Nuland, descendant of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, was a revered surgeon who taught bioethics, medicine, and the history of medicine at Yale. Now, this is how he recounts meeting his first wife.
When I took one look at her and I just decided that's the person I'm going to marry. And I convinced her in 6 weeks to marry me, and so we were engaged for another 6 weeks, then we got married.
It was love at first sight. He had just become chief resident at Yale at 29 years old, but things would then take a turn for the worst.
What I didn't know at that time was that she was bipolar. I didn't know that either. And for the next years, she would become depressed for 6 months, and when April came, she'd suddenly, within days, become manic. And we had some really bad times, but we did have 2 perfectly wonderful children.
Sherwin Nuland would describe his marriage to Victoria's mother in a TED Talk given in 2001, saying,
In the 1960s, in a marriage, to use the word bad would be perhaps the understatement of the year. It was dreadful. As things got worse, as we really began to hate each other, I became progressively depressed over a period of a couple of years, trying to save this marriage, which was inevitably not to be saved.
As her father admits, this was severely deteriorating his mental health. The constant fights, resentment, and hate between the two was weighing too much on Sherwin. All the while, he's still having to prepare for surgeries that can take up to 12 to 18 hours to complete. He goes on to elaborate this more.
Oh, my major surgical cases, I was scheduling them for 1 o'clock in the afternoon because I couldn't get out of bed before about 11 o'clock. Anybody who's been depressed here knows what that's like. I couldn't even pull the covers off myself.
All of this would finally culminate when Sherwin had to be checked into a mental ward at his university, and he would stay there for 13 months. It would be an understatement to say Victoria Nuland had a difficult childhood. A bipolar mother, a depressed father, fighting every day, hatred, resentment. But there's more. Victoria Nuland attended the prestigious boarding school known as Choate Rosemary Hall. She was a graduate of the school in 1979. This institution is famous for its remarkable list of alumni, which includes governors, State Department officials, actors, poets, and so on. Perhaps its most illustrious alumnus is President John F. Kennedy, who was a student there in the 1930s alongside his older brother. Notable figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt were frequent guest speakers at the school. Essentially, if you had the means, Choate Rosemary Hall was the place to receive a top-tier education. The school is also notorious, as it's recently been uncovered that the school had substantiated cases of sexual misconduct. Some of it goes back to the early 1960s, all the way to the early 2000s. In the New York Times coverage of the scandal, they reported that the school had prevented allegations of sexual conduct from getting out for decades. According to the report, sexual misconduct matters were handled internally and quietly. Even if a teacher had been terminated for sexual misconduct with another student, the rest of the faculty were told very little, and sometimes nothing, about what had happened. As recently as 2010, a faculty member named Charles Timlin had kissed a student, made inappropriate comments to her, But the headmaster of the school decided that this behavior had not warranted Charles's termination. It was only until the abused student's father had contacted the school, after which they eventually dismissed Mr. Timlin for his behavior. There is no direct evidence that Victoria herself ever experienced any kind of abuse or would have known it was going on. However, in the investigative report published by an independent group looking into all the accusations, they would find at least 12 staff and teachers who worked in the school from 1969 to as late as 2016. 5 of the 12 staff were working in the school between 1975 to 1979, the same years Victoria was in attendance. Now, we can't make any direct connections between her and sexual abuse, and it would be wrong to do so. But if it is the case that this was just a fact of life in the school's culture, everyone kind of knew this was going on, what kind of psychological damage would that do to someone in their teens? As former student Cheyenne Montgomery, who graduated in 1992 and was abused by 2 teachers there, said, these things were really embedded in the culture, and not just at Choate. There is something that I neglected to mention, something that I skipped over in the beginning of this video. See, when I said Sherwin Nuland was born to immigrant parents who came from Eastern Europe, well, in Sherwin Nuland's book, Lost in America, he talks about his father being from an area called Bessarabia. His father left Bessarabia in 1907. What is Bessarabia? Bessarabia is now modern-day Ukraine/Moldova. This means that Victoria Nuland has Ukrainian lineage in her. What does this mean exactly? Does this explain some of her motivations? All this and more in the next chapter.